So he says, on the one hand, back to 1 Corinthians 1, Jews demand signs. And what about the Greeks? The Greeks seek wisdom. Now, the Greek word there for wisdom is Sophia. Sophia. And we get the word philosophy from that. Philosophia in Greek literally means, people usually translate it as love of wisdom. And that's right, but a philos isn't just any kind of love, it's the love of a friend. Right? Philosophia. So a person who is a lover of wisdom, or a person who is a friend of wisdom, is a philosopher. That's what a philosopher is, a friend of wisdom. Okay? So the Greeks seek for wisdom. In other words, they want philosophy. So they want to use reason to verify the gospel. It needs to be subject to the analysis of philosophical reasoning. Okay? So there are different ways to verify it. You can verify it empirically through signs and wonders, or you can verify it rationally through reason and philosophy. And Paul says, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to Gentiles. Okay, so he preaches the cross here. Now, in order to understand those two responses that he's going to give from Jews and Gentiles to the cross, we have to put the cross and the crucifixion of Jesus in its first century Jewish setting, but also its first century Greco-Roman setting, right? How would crucifixion have been understood in a first century Greco-Roman and Jewish setting? In order to see this, there are two quotes that I can give you that will help. The first one is from the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, 22, 23, there's a passage from the law of Moses that actually says that anyone who dies being hung on a tree, right, is accursed of God. So listen to these words. This is from Deuteronomy 21. Quote, if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he's put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is accursed by God. You shall not defile your land which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance. Now, if you look at that passage, strictly speaking, what it's saying is anyone who is executed by hanging is considered to be accursed. Now, most of us don't link hanging with crucifixion in our minds. We think of it as two different ways of being executed. But in the ancient world, they were tied together because various forms of suspension on wood and death through crucifixion, or sometimes just called suspension, hanging a person on some erected form of wood was, whatever shape the wood might be in, associated with or identified as what we would call crucifixion. In other words, there were a variety of ways to execute someone by hanging, and one of them was crucifixion. We would think of as crucifixion. So by the 1st century AD, when the method of execution by crucifixion as Christ was crucified was very widespread under Roman rule, because that's the method they used to execute slaves, this passage was linked with the method of execution that we call crucifixion. And you can see this in early Jewish writings from the time of Jesus. Or you see it in Paul himself. For example, if you look at Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, Paul says this, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, quote, cursed be everyone who hangs on a tree. So you can see there in Galatians 3, Paul himself explicitly interprets the curse of hanging in Deuteronomy 21 as applying in the case of Jesus' crucifixion, because he's suspended from the wood of a tree when he's suspended on the wood of the cross. So if you take that back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the reason Paul says that the cross is a stumbling block to Jews is because the Greek word there for stumbling block is scandalon. It's something that makes you trip up, right? Like if a scandalon's in the road, you might trip over it and fall down. So the reason the crucifixion of Jesus is a scandal or stumbling block to the Jews is because according to Jewish law, as read in the 1st century, a person who's crucified is accursed of God, right? So you got Christians like Paul going around saying, Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the King of Israel, Jesus is the Son of God. Meanwhile, a Jewish person hearing that for the first time will look at the Torah and say, well, hold on, how did he die? He died by being hung on a tree? He died by crucifixion? Well, according to the Torah, a person who's hung on a tree, a person who's crucified is not blessed by God, but cursed by God, right? So some Jews, according to Paul, saw the crucifixion as a countersign to Jesus' messianic identity. They saw the crucifixion as a reason for disbelieving the gospel rather than believing the gospel, right? So it was a stumbling block. On the other side of the coin, if you look at crucifixion in a Greco-Roman setting from a Roman perspective, crucifixion was considered the most shameful form of death because it was a death that was both horrific in terms of its physical suffering that it entailed and the torture that it entailed, but also because of the public shame of it being reserved only for slaves. Paul will learn this truth very harshly himself when, at the end of his life, he's executed by decapitation, because there were two forms of execution. Decapitation was how you would execute a Roman citizen. Crucifixion was how you would execute a slave. That's why Peter is crucified, according to Jerome and other early church historians, when he's executed in Rome, because he's not a citizen like Paul. He doesn't have Roman citizenship. He's a Jewish slave of the empire. So Cicero, first century Roman orator, famous, one of the most famous Roman writers, said this about the shame of crucifixion. Cicero not only called the cross, quote, the tree of shame. That's how he described it. But he also had this to say about crucifixion. Quote, the executioner, the veiling of the head, and the very word cross should be far removed not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes, and his ears. For it is not only the actual occurrence of these things, but indeed the very mention of them that is unworthy of a Roman citizen and a free man. That's from Cicero's Oration Against Verus, number 16. So Cicero is basically saying that crucifixion is so shameful, we shouldn't even talk about it. A Roman citizen shouldn't even mention it. That is totally reserved for slaves and nobodies in the empire. So when Paul comes around and he's got Greeks like in the church at Corinth, and he's saying to them, Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, is the Son of God and the King of the world, the Savior of the world. From a Roman perspective, this man who was crucified is a nobody. He's a slave. And so the Greek response to Paul's proclamation of Christ crucified is that it's foolishness to say that the Savior of the world and the King of the universe was crucified. Because according to a Roman, if someone's crucified, by definition, that means they're a slave and not a king. It means they're a slave and not a citizen, much less the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. See how that works? So when Paul says that to the Greeks the cross was foolishness, the Greek word there is actually moria, M-O-R-I-A, which means it's moronic. We get the word moron from that Greek word. It's idiocy to say that a crucified man is the Savior and King of the world. But that's what Paul's going around preaching, right? So the Jews demand signs, the Greeks demand wisdom. I preach Christ crucified. I should say the apostles preach Christ crucified. A scandalon to the Jews and moronic idiocy to the Greeks. But to those of us who are called, Christ the power and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is stronger than human wisdom. It's more powerful than human wisdom. And the weakness of God is stronger than men. So good, man. Paul, so powerful there. This is really pressing into the mystery of the cross. It is a scandal. It does seem stupid. It does seem idiocy. It does seem moronic. If you look at the cross through the eyes of the world, if you look at it from an earthly perspective, but if you look beyond the visible to the invisible mystery of who it is hanging on the cross and why he's hanging there and what he's accomplishing through his passion and through the outpouring of his blood, it becomes the very vehicle through which God will redeem not just the Jews, and God will save not just the people of Israel, but the nations as well, but the Gentiles as well. Because the problem of sin is a universal problem. It's not just a Jewish problem, it's not just a Greek problem. It's a universal human problem. And so it's going to take a universal Savior to atone for it. And that's what he accomplishes. And that's why Paul goes around preaching Christ and him crucified. It's the heart of the good news because it's the sign of God's love for humanity. Pours out his love on the cross.